John, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, everyone. Um, I'm not I'm not nearly as structured as our previous speaker. I don't have a PowerPoint deck. Instead, I'm going to just kind of give you guys the quick version of the path that I took in, sort of doing a technology transfer and a startup and an app, and talk about some of the lessons that I learned, or maybe the obvious things that kind of banged me on the head along the way, and hear your questions. So basically, my story, yes, I'm a Pace alum. I studied physics and electrical engineering at Pace. And eventually I wound up getting my PhD at Georgia Tech, studying human-computer interaction. Human-computer interaction is a wonderful field, just digging really deep into the nuts and bolts of human psychology, of social science, and design, and kind of integrating those together to figure out what is it we should actually be building for people, like what's actually going to impact people's lives. So while I was doing this, I was working on my doctoral thesis, and one day this guy from Microsoft came to give a lecture, and he had this big touch screen, this big like multi-finger touch screen. And this was back in the days when there were no iPads yet. This was shortly before the iPad came out. So this thing was really cool. And I was busy working on 100 things, but I said, you know what? I'll come and attend this talk. That's the first big lesson for me, right? Like, expose yourself to as many different ideas, different points of view, different talks, different lectures, read things you wouldn't normally read. Because so often we kind of get in sort of an intellectual rut, and it can be very hard to get out of that unless you sort of expose yourself to things you wouldn't normally. So anyway, I went to this talk. The guy at this big table had these amazing gestural interfaces, and I loved it. And my thought was, wow, I want to interact with computers like this. But this is never going to happen unless we can figure out a way to leverage this model of interaction for real productivity work. And Microsoft had no idea what to do with the thing. They were just like, this is cool. And so I thought about, what if we use this for like reading and note taking and things like that? I talked to my thesis advisor about it. He said, it's a very cool idea, but don't let it distract you from your doctoral dissertation. I said, okay, I will. Then about a year later, my doctoral dissertation exploded. Turned out someone had done what I did back in 1994. And so I wound up needing a new idea really fast. And I had written this one down. Second, maybe the number one lesson I took from grad school: anytime you have a reasonably good idea, write it down, because the day will come when you need it. I ended up working on this, showed it off to, did some initial research into reading theory, was thinking that, this kind of more fluid gestural way of working with reading and note taking, maybe there's actually something to it. Some of the past literature suggested that maybe there would be a need for something like this. So I talked to a bunch of professors about it. Everyone shot me down. Everyone. They were like, this doesn't sound like a doctoral thesis. They were like, this sounds like a consumer product. They were like, I don't see how this would be a doctoral thesis or a consumer product. Everyone was really negative about it. And there were only one person who was actually really supportive, and that was my thesis advisor. And the lesson for me is, if you go into the point of actually doing a startup, you need emotional support. And sometimes that might be telling you you're going down the wrong path. But the emotional, the psychological toll can be actually really intense. You need people around you who are there as a support group, whether it's your family, your friends, your startup community, or a mix of them, but it can't be your employees. That can't be their role. Okay, so I went on. Just because my thesis advisor was like, I still think it's a cool idea, I built some prototype mockups, put them in front of users. And that's major lesson. I know everyone this morning has been harping on this, and rightfully so. Your user needs to be at the center of your creative process. The process we used in grad school was called user-centered design. User needs to be at the center all the time. Oftentimes your user can't actually create the concept for you because they're not designers, but they can help you refine that concept from a concept into a product and eventually into a business. So went around, put this in front of some users, did a bunch of research, did a bunch of studies, did diary studies, observing how people read and what problems people face in reading. Did interviews with people to understand what are the challenges they have when they read, where does it get difficult. Took all that data, analyzed it, looked for the themes, looked for the connective tissue between the different problems they have, looked for the underlying problems. And it yielded a lot of great results. We could publish some papers on it. But the most interesting piece was when I actually put my prototype in front of them, very rough prototype I built. And everyone started saying, where do I buy this? And I said, silly, you don't buy it. At best, this gets me out of grad school. And eventually I realized that was the wrong answer. And so I started exploring commercialization. And then I went through the very challenging process of technology transfer. taking a sort of university abstract, this is a cool idea, and actually making it into a product. Turns out that is ridiculously harder than it initially seems. But there are some things you can do to make your life easier. The first is, if you actually decide to go that route, make sure there's very good clarity around who owns the technology. Make sure you have a really solid contract with the university around your rights to the technology versus the rights the university can give to other folks. So if anyone is going down that road, by all means, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I have a lot of very, very painful lessons and scars I learned doing that. So eventually we got the product, we got the technology, we got the license, and then it was time to build a product. And this was another really big challenge, right? You have an idea that in the lab, you show it to people and they're like, yes, I want this so much. But it's very easy, especially for like techno geeks like me, right? That you really focus on the artifact, right? This is a great piece of software. This piece of software is wonderful and does things that are great that people want. That's cool. But that's only a tiny piece of it, right? Even aside from building the business, even the thing you build, you're not building a piece of software. You're building an experience for people. And whatever artifact you make, whatever app you make, it needs to interface it needs to not just be good in the abstract, it needs to interface with the entire socio-technical ecosystem that person lives in, right? So how does that person really get work done? Is it done by themselves or is it done in a team? Where does that person store information? Do they store it on Google Drive or do they store it on Dropbox or both? Well, you might say, oh, it doesn't matter. My product is so great. People will make the effort to get around those. No, the first few people will make that effort. And that will give you this deceptive sense that, oh, wow, everyone's good. No, but that's only the first few people, right? Like if you haven't read Crossing the Chasm, you need to read it. But the problem is, most of the people will not make any extra effort to use your product. You need to understand where they keep their data, how they live, who they interface with, what their real socio-technical lives look like when you create your actual experience. Okay, so, and again, as you do this, your users should be in the flow all the time. As your product starts to get a little further along, you might want to actually assemble a board of user advisors, right? A group of people who you just show your mock-ups to, and you say, what do you think of this? How would you use this? Do you understand what the screen is even showing you? One of the things I learned is it's very, very easy to not even recognize how confusing the screens that you make are, right? For one really critical part, the onboarding of our app, I literally went to shopping malls and just went to like random people who had an iPad and was just like, hey, can you look at this screen and tell me if you understand what you should do next? Despite 7 years and a doctorate in human computer interaction, those screens were still utterly confusing for people. And so I made a lot of refinements, iterations based on that. You should definitely do the same. Okay, so next step, time to actually start the business. I went out to raise VC money. Complete failure, did not work at all. Part of the reason why was the intellectual property license situation I had with the university. Hence, I talk about the scar tissue. There were other reasons too. Learning how to pitch your product as a business is very different than learning how to write an academic paper on your product. Like, ooh, what a shock, but it is. But eventually I was, like, I can't raise money. What do I do? So I just wrote the first version of the app myself. By the grace of God, I actually got it out, and Apple liked it, and we got, a huge promotion from them on launch day, and we ended up getting it out, and I ended up raising a little bit of money. And my first product was free, and that was probably a mistake. Hard to say, but it was probably a mistake. Just as the previous speaker mentioned, you want to be thinking in terms of how do I build this into a business? There are cases, I believe, where giving your product away for free at first makes sense, but I think those are far fewer than people tend to assume. Assume you need a monetization strategy from the get-go unless you have a good reason to doubt that. So, okay, so I put my product out there. Lots and lots of people downloaded it. It was really, really cool. Then about a year later, I said, all right, let's try to actually make money from this thing. I released the first in-app purchase upsell. Didn't go anywhere. Made almost no one was buying it. And I was devastated. One of the things that got us through that was we had a big button in the app at the advice of one of my advisors to contact us, even though it was incredibly expensive to basically have a constantly funded, fast turnaround email customer support for every single free user, but we did. And that was really good, because it turns out if you make it easy enough for people to contact you, they will. We got tons of extraordinary feedback about what was missing from the app. and people made it abundantly clear what they wanted to pay for, what they would be willing to pay for in it. So a few months later, and really this is what drove this next pizza. A few months later, we released our inking package, which took what the people were asking for, but then sort of conceptually extended it into a different form that made more sense for our app. And the sales were fantastic, and we started actually making money. And it was yet another very good lesson in listening to your user and really having a lot of back and forth with them. So that's kind of, I know I'm at just about 10 minutes here, so I'll probably pause now and take any questions. But I guess the biggest thing for me that I'll just leave you with is more than anything else, product market fit is the center of everything you're doing, right? Like, raising money, all that other stuff, it's all secondary. Aim for product market fit, get your users in the loop from the very first day, from your first PowerPoint mockups through to the end, and keep them in the loop throughout the process.